Hello, my name's Ken Allsen, and I've been asked today to talk to you a bit about a book of mine. And here it is. The title is Master Architect, The Life and Works of Harold Crawford. This book was published in 2014 by an arts grant from the state of Minnesota and published that year by the History Center of Olmsted County here in Rochester, Minnesota. And if after hearing what I've got to say, you decide you'd like to buy a copy of this book, which would be nice, please order it from the History Center's gift shop. They have a good supply of copies. And they also, if you buy it from them, they will get 100% of the profits from the book, the proceeds. And none of them will go to me. So this isn't a commercial message. So you can find them on their website and contact information there. So that being said, let me get on with the book itself. The book is divided into two parts. Obviously, part one is the life of Harold Crawford, and part two is an analysis of his work and a catalog of his work. So the actual architectural history is in the second part of the book. The first part will deal with Harold Crawford, his life, and of course he was an iconic architect here in Rochester for 50 years. And so the book talks about him and all his many buildings. So let's start at the beginning. Harold's parents were Carrie Seymour Crawford, and she was a school marm, educated at a normal school here in Minnesota, taught school for a few years, and then she met his father named Frank Crawford. And Frank was a different kettle of fish. He was a kind of a ne'er-do-well, a gambler, fairly fast talker. And my thought is that he swept her off her feet. They were married in 1884, moved to a little dirt farm out in way in southeastern Minnesota, Beaver Creek Township, last thing before South Dakota. And there they lived, Frank farmed. And 2 years later, in 1886, Harold's older brother Alan was born. 1888, Harold followed. And Harold's birth was notable only for the fact that he was born at the heights of the 1888 blizzard, which historians say was the worst to ever hit the High Plains. Well, Harold's life for the first few years following his birth was very notable and right out of a Horatio Alger story. When Harold was still less than a year old, his father grew bored with farming, moved the family to Seattle, settled in, and were not there very long when he discovered that he was, this gold rush he was hearing about in Alaska was for him, and he took off for the Klondike, leaving Carrie, his wife, and his two little boys, and also the baby she was carrying, leaving them totally on their own. She was virtually without funds, contacted her sister back east, and she wired funds enough for her to get on a train and come back to Minnesota, where she moved back to a little farm just east of Rochester, where she had grown up and now farmed by her parents. And she moved in with them with her two young sons. And unfortunately, on the way, she had lost the baby she was carrying and had a miscarriage in Denver. So it was just the two boys and their mom and the grandparents on the farm. So the boys both grew up on the farm, doing chores and following grandpa around and learning all the things there were to know about farming. Their schooling was one-room school in Orion Township, and it was sporadic at best. In those days, the far more took precedence over school. And so they went to school when they could. In 1903, both of them, even though there were 2 years age difference, finished the 8th grade. And whereupon their mother, who wanted them to go on to high school, sent them to the nearby town of Iota to take the Regents exam, which was something Minnesota claimed in those days of an 8th grade graduate in order to enter high school. And because of the kind of the poor education they had received, neither boy could pass any of the sections of the test. Even after tutoring with a private tutor in Iota, they couldn't. But neither one of them were stupid, and their mother knew it, and she knew that to have a good chance of a good life, they needed a high school education, and furthermore, college education. So she took kind of a clever path. She bundled both boys up and sent them in different directions. The older brother, Alan, was sent to one of her sisters, a teacher living in Wisconsin, and the other Harold, was sent west to South Dakota, specifically Deadwood, South Dakota, where her other sister lived with her husband, who was a publisher of the local newspaper. So Harold went to South Dakota. Both boys immediately entered high school because neither state had a Regents exam, and did very well in school, and were sent for at the very end of 1903, after one full term was completed in high school for each of them. They returned to Rochester this time, not to Iota, because the mother had bought a boarding house and was operating that. So they had a reunion, the three of them had a pleasant Christmas, and the day after New Year's, Carrie Crawford marched her sons into Rochester High School and announced they were both transfer students and presented the credentials. And they were admitted, thus bypassing the Regents exam. And thank goodness for mothers. They always look out for us. So Harold and his brother both went to high school, graduating in 1908 from Rochester High School. Alan, the older, was a popular boy. He was very outgoing, very self-confident, and a good athlete. His little brother Harold, on the other hand, was kind of the opposite of that. He was shy, somewhat reserved, and a very good student. And as a result, when they both graduated in 1908, Harold graduated at the head of his class. Now he then had to talk with his mother. She said, "Harold, now what are you going to do with yourself? What are your plans?" And he said, "Well, I've just always loved to paint, and I love to draw. Have since I was little." He said, "I would like to be an artist." And she gave you that great advice I think my mother gave me, and a lot of other mothers did. She said, "Harold, you should really find something you can work at that you enjoy, and to support yourself while you starve as an artist." And he followed her advice. He applied at the University of Illinois because he figured the closest thing he could find to architecture was his love for art. So he did so. He applied at Illinois, and because of his academic record and also the samples of his work that he'd sent with him, he was admitted as a scholarship student, and he did well. He prospered at the University of Illinois. He gained in self-confidence. We have a diary at the History Center that he wrote during his junior year there, so there's a good insight into the fact that he had learned to be social and a little more outgoing and very self-confident compared to what he was as a boy. He graduated again with honors in 1913, and he wasn't done yet. He had had a taste of academia and training in architecture, so he applied to Harvard University, which had just instituted their first master's degree program in art and architecture. He completed that in 1916. Now, along the way, both in Chicago and in Boston, he had worked for local architects and gained a lot of experience, both to support himself and also to gain that experience and gain a little reputation. So as a result, he was licensed as an architect in both states and could have gone anywhere as an architect then. But he opted instead to return to Rochester because his mother, still operating the boarding house, was getting up in years. His brother had married after getting a degree in engineering at Minnesota and was living up in the Twin Cities. Harold was still single, and he thought it would devolve upon him to look after his mother in her old age, since he didn't have other commitments. So he came back to Rochester. The other thing that attracted him there was a great market for architects here at that point in time, because the Mayo Clinic had just shortly before that been established and were hiring many well-to-do architects or well-to-do doctors from the East Coast and even from Europe. And when they came, they wanted architect-designed houses. And Harold was one of a few that were sort of anointed, and he had kind of a leg up because he was a local boy, unlike the other firms. And so he practiced for 1 year and he had great success, early success. But in 1917, World War I was joined by the United States on the side of the Allies. And Harold had a reserve officer commission in the Army because he'd been ROTC at Illinois. So he immediately volunteered and went off to join the Army. And the day before he left for his initial training, the last thing he did was put an engagement ring on the hand of his sweetheart, Mae Fisher. And off he went, and he served 3 years in a camp in northern Florida. He didn't go to Europe, but his job was, it really fit his needs. And what he was good at was to assist in the teaching of construction battalions to build Army camps, because the United States needed a great many of them in the United States because their army had grown from almost nothing to 1 million men in a very short time. So he spent 3 years there. He managed to get promoted and discharged as a first lieutenant. Came back to Rochester in 1919, and the very first week he was there, he married Carrie. Excuse me, no, Carrie's his mother. He married Mae Fisher, and they moved in with Carrie and set up housekeeping on the upper floor of the boarding house. Harold renewed his practice, and it prospered and took off very quickly. So within a few years, he was able to buy a very nice double lot in the area called Pill Hill, which is where he had already designed a number of houses for doctors and so forth, hence the nickname for the subdivision. And it's still there today, and it's still a very attractive neighborhood and favorite spot for walking or driving around just to look at the wonderful old houses that are there, of which Harold ended up designing about, I think it was 43 of them, including his own, which is still there on that 2-acre lot. They lived happily in the house. They had 2 children. They adopted a baby daughter shortly after they were married, and took in a foster son who was about 13 during the Depression. Mrs. Crawford died in 1945, and Harold's daughter died in New York in about 1972, I believe. And this foster son is still with us here in Rochester, and even assisted me with this book. So that pretty much brings us up to the point in 1956 when Harold decided to hang it up as an architect. Now, as an architect, he was sort of notable because he never hired a draftsman. And I'm going to address that a little bit in the second half when we talk about the second half of the book. But he lived on a good many years in the house, thanks to his foster son who would come pick him up every day, take him home with him for supper. And Harold had 3 grandsons, so he enjoyed being with them, and then take him home again after supper. Except Harold insisted that he did not go on Sunday. He would fend for himself because he wanted Dale and his family to have that time to themselves. So the other thing that he took up was watercolor painting, and he produced a tremendous work of watercolors, many of which still are around. And a number of those are in the collection at the History Center and can be seen in their museum there. He loved to paint. He finally, he and I got to be friends, and he became not only a friend, but a mentor, and very much influenced what it is I'm doing today, which is basically worrying about old buildings and preservation of them, and writing and speaking about just that. He influenced me greatly in that. So it was kind of a sad note for me. And one day in 1981, that I received a phone call, and it said, "I have bad news for you, Ken. Your good friend Harold Crawford died unexpectedly last night at St. Mary's Hospital." And he had not been in the hospital prior to that. He was taken. It was an emergency, and he was taken to the hospital, and he died early in the morning that day. So, of course, I had a lump in my throat and tears in my eyes when I heard it. But then I yanked myself up because I thought, okay, 93 years old, and to die unexpectedly at that age is a pretty good epitaph. And I've never forgotten that. And it affects my attitude about doing work of this sort, even into my own 8th decade, and tend to keep doing it as long as I can. I don't know if I'll match Harold, but it'd be all right with me. So anyway, that's pretty much sums up Harold's life. Let's talk just briefly about his works. Now he, as I said, he was notable that he rarely, I think never, did he hire a draftsman. At the History Center, we have 400 rolls of drawings reflecting his entire work. These were brought there after he died, and they're in the archives there. The interesting thing about it is they were cataloged, but only by what was on the title block. And I had the opportunity to spend an entire summer going through all 400 rolls. And I very quickly grew to recognize Harold's hand as a draftsman. And I realized when I was done that I had not seen any hand in the drawings but his. So he made every one of those 400 rolls of drawings himself. Now they represent within that 400, 180 built works. And I define a built work, of course, first as a structure that is brand new and built to his design. I further expanded that definition of built work to those houses that he was commissioned to remodel, and his changes were extensive enough to change the outward fabric of the building enough that it was recognizable as his work. So that comes to 180 out of 400. Now that isn't unusual if you know that in those days, architects did not just successful commissions of new structures and big commissions for remodeling, but they also had minor remodeling jobs, and they made lots and lots of drawings as proposals for which they didn't get the commissions. Now that is pretty typical for architects in that day and age, and for all I know today, it pretty much is the same way they do business. So we have all 400 rolls of those drawings. It was my job, if you will, back in the 1990s, to recatalog all those drawings, but this time as a detailed architectural catalog of his work, and I did so, and that full catalog is on file at the History Center. It was while I was there that the director of the History Center first encouraged me to write a book about Harold. And so I did. And that was the first book about Harold, and it was done in 1995. I never was satisfied with the book. It was done kind of on the cheap, and but yet people bought it. It sold out, and it went out of print in probably about 2012 or so. At that point in time, the History Center approached me about doing a reprint, and I opted to say no reprint. So, because first place, I didn't like the format of the first book and the printing and the quality, and I also knew that the publisher had gone out of business and there were no source for the galleys anywhere. So what I suggested instead was that I rewrite the book completely from scratch, and which I did, and utilizing all the new research that I'd received in the previous years since the first book was published. I retitled the work to avoid confusion, I hope, and it was published in 2014. So what can I say about his work as an architect? While I know that he did collaborate on the rare occasion with other architects, local architects specifically, but I think of all those projects he did, of all his built works, there are only about 5 probably on that he actually had another architect's name on the drawings with his, just in very major works, public buildings and so forth. So we're back to the point was, how did he produce all this work? Those were the days when, architects visited building sites fairly regularly and met the clients there and made last minute changes. Now, Harold's work today, everybody kind of locally here, he's very well known, and they tend to associate him with 2 locales. One is Pill Hill, where his house is and all the other fancy houses are that he designed over his 50-year career. And they also focus on one building downtown, which is the old 1936 public library designed by him. And it's now owned by the Mayo Clinic. When our new library was built, they bought the old building, and they are great stewards of the building. They've kept it especially the exterior has not been touched as far as remodel, just rejuvenation. And that's now the Mitchell Center for the Mayo Medical School. So those are the 2 buildings that are sort of iconic to Harold. What people don't really seem to think about is the fact that where were all those 400 other things that he did? And they were all over probably about a 100-mile radius from Rochester. So that takes in southeastern Minnesota, northern Iowa, and western Wisconsin. And he did projects in all those, all over. In every city in southeastern Minnesota of any size, and some of not much size, there is a building by Harold Crawford. So, and then they also think that he was just a wonderful residential architect, and that the library was kind of a one-off for a residential architect. That is not the case. Harold did many, many different kinds of buildings. He did schools, he did churches, other public buildings, apartments. He also did one power plant that I know of, and a couple of post offices. So he was not only a one-man band, he played a lot of different instruments. At any rate, the catalog itself starts off with an analysis of his work, and I'm not going to try to do that here in the short time I have. And then it's followed by 180 half-page entries, one for each of his built works. And each one has an illustration with it, which is either a photo of the existing building, or if the existing building has been so remodeled that it doesn't look like Harold's original, I made some drawings and those are pen and ink drawings, and those are in lieu of photographs. So those are there with the dates and the owner names and plan numbers if they exist at the History Center. So that's pretty much it for the book, and I hope you think it's interesting enough to take a look at it. If you've already read it and you're seeing this, then thank you very much for buying it. I hope you bought it at the History Center. They need the money a lot worse than I do. Thanks again. Thanks for having me. And once this global pandemic is over and we no longer have to hunker in our houses, I look forward to seeing all my friends, old and new, face to face. Thank you very much.